In this video, I was meant to show you how I painted this landscape in my sketchbook, but somehow I messed up the recording and I'm missing a whole middle section of it. So instead, I'll just focus on the last stage of the painting and explain how I created this intricate foreground texture, as well as adding some final touches to the painting. Knowing when to stop and how to add those last few details to painting is a skill in itself. So I do hope you find this shorter video just as useful as seeing the whole demo. I did manage to film the first few minutes of my painting, including the sketch. So I'm just going to show you that at very high speed. So you just get to see quickly my sketching process. Now I am putting down the first light wash of that main area. Let's call that the fore and middle ground. And I'm doing that with raw sienna mixed in with some gunk that's on the palette, some grays, a bit of blue. There's a bit of yellow ochre in there as well. And I want to have the light coming in from the left-hand side into my painting. So I'm keeping the tops of the rocks super light. That's where the sun will hit it, or the skylight. And then also the background is lighter than the foreground, and that's when I'm adding some burnt sienna. I always use pretty much the same colors for most of my paintings. Raw sienna, ultramarine, and burnt sienna are the holy trinity for me that I use for most of the base colors, and the neutrals and earth tones. I can get quite a range from warm to cool grays with just these three colors. And in this first wet in wet wash, there is literally nothing to lose. So I like to push it as far as I can and continue to add colors and values and shift my color temperatures around from warm to cool. And I'm adding a little bit of cerulean blue into now because that has a granulating effect, which will give this first rock in the foreground a nice texture. Now I'm letting this dry, and then I've painted in most of the second layer and the mid values, as you can see here. So now we're jumping ahead to where I finish off that foreground, which is what this video is all about. I start off with dry brushing a earthy tone made up of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, surprise, surprise. And I'm just intent to creating some initial ground texture there. I have no real plan. I'm just letting the brush glide over my paper. I hold it quite flat at a flat angle, and so that I don't just use the tip but also the body of the brush. I also vary my colors a bit. There's a bit more green there in the left side, in the bottom left corner, and then I just gently go back and forth and create some random patterns. I'm also never afraid to drop in some water into a wet area when I want to create lots of texture, or just dab my brush willy-nilly on the page. I'm really just after creating texture and variation into my foreground. A few more water splatters, especially in that bottom corner there. I want that to have lots of texture. And then I drop in some table salt. As you may know, this will create a lovely texture once it's dry. As you can see here, it really already does look like a rock. Now, this point I'm working on now, I feel like it's too dark and too hard-edged, so I'm just going to soften that up and make this look a little bit more believable as a little outcrop. And same with the one above. Got to be careful with your darks that they don't punch holes into your composition. But with watercolor, easy to fix. Just a bit of clean water and a finger, and you can smudge things around. So my random brushwork has created some wonderful rocks and little undulations in the foreground. That wasn't planned, just intended. And this is when we capitalize on those opportunities and look at what we can turn into things. So by just adding a little bit of a shadow there, I'm creating those shelves or flat rocks that are cropping out of the ground. This is magic that only watercolor can give you, because it has these wonderful surprises if you just let the brush do its work and add water to it, and don't really have anything specific in mind, and we are presented with these wonderful opportunities. I'm also going to punch a bit more shadow underneath that rock. Love how this rock turned out with a bit of scratching and painting, so I want to make sure that, again, I make the most of it and really draw the eye to that one, even though the focal point is probably a bit further in the back where the trees are, but it makes for a nice counterpoint for the eye to rest on, so you don't have to dwell just on the trees. And to pull the eye back a little bit further into the painting, I'm also going to strengthen a bit of the shadow underneath that rock there, just to keep consistency with the level of details in the different focal planes. I also want to tone down the tops of the rocks a little bit so that the ones near the tree are brighter and lighter and attract our attention just that a little bit more. And here I'm adding a bit of contrast behind the rock because I wasn't quite happy with the silhouette of it. It is a bit too tonal, to be honest. I should have probably used a bit more color in the foreground rocks just to set them apart, but we roll with what we've got. And speaking of adding more detail, I'm also finalizing those trees in the background with a very thin paintbrush. This could be a rigger or just whatever fine liners that you've got available to you, just to add a few calligraphy marks into the painting. But this was all about the foreground, and you can see how easily I created this foreground texture that looks very, very complicated and almost impossible to recreate, but it was literally a couple of washes, some water, a bit of salt, and then just using the random patterns as a baseline to solidify them with some shadows underneath them and turn them into real things, into rocks that weren't there before. A bit of white gouache just to add some highlights and create a bit of stronger contrast in some of the elements of the painting. And that's usually my last step in the painting, is adding calligraphy marks with a fine brush, adding some white gouache to lift out a couple of highlights and just make some small corrections.